In September 1783, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay signed the Treaty of Paris in the city for which it is named. The agreement effectively ends the Revolutionary War and catapults the new United States of America onto the world stage. In April 1789, while Jefferson was still in Paris, his friend and fellow Virginian, George Washington, had been sworn in as the first president of the United States. And all of the most powerful voices of the Revolution are vying for seats in his cabinet.
Washington is a president without precedent. He is filling in the role of president with only the broadest outlines being established by the Constitution.
He wants Jefferson to be Secretary of State, particularly because Jefferson has all this international experience as a diplomat. But Washington has to beg Jefferson to take the job. And he sends James Madison to see him. He says, hey, are you going to accept this? And Jefferson says, I'm not sure. And Madison has to tell Washington to ask him again. This is testimony to how highly Washington thought of Jefferson. He sort of bites his lip and writes to him again and says, please serve as Secretary of State. The country really needs you. And Jefferson writes, well, if you really want me, I guess I'll do it.
Jefferson had intended to eventually return to France. But in March of 1790, he heads to the new U.S. Capitol in New York City to serve in America's first cabinet, alongside his soon-to-be rival, Revolutionary War hero Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton, Washington's young aide-de-camp, is tapped as Treasury Secretary. Now, Hamilton and Jefferson famously feuded throughout most of their adult life. And one of Hamilton's attacks on Jefferson was that he was an elite who talked about populism. And Jefferson looked down on Hamilton as an immigrant upstart.
Fundamentally, each believes the other represents an existential threat to the Republic. Hamilton believes that Jefferson wants to overthrow all order. Jefferson believes that Hamilton is restoring monarchy to the United States.
Jefferson is horrified to realize that the system of government that has been set up while he was in France seems to be heading towards more centralized power, what he sees as more British direction. In particular, in Hamilton's plan to centralize the federal treasury and to begin accumulating debt to build the United States.
Hamilton's financial plan, which is modeled on the Bank of England, is to consolidate one national debt that the Treasury controls and the government repays.
It's a system built on a recognizable British model, and Jefferson hates that. And he also wants to get the cabinet out of New York. He doesn't like cities. He doesn't like New York City.
He believes cities were sources of corruption, they were sources of inequality. The residents of cities, in his view, didn't make good citizens.
He wants to move the center of gravity further towards the south. And so one of the great critical compromises in American history is where over dinner at Jefferson's house, he brings together Madison and Hamilton and negotiates moving the capital down to Virginia area off Potomac, but accepting Hamilton's financial plan for a more centralized financial system, where the banking center will remain in New York. In the infamous room where it happened, they both got what they most wanted. And it ends up being a pretty good trade in the fullness of time.
And so there was an opportunity there when they did work together productively.
But you get that sense of the seeds of disagreement that will really rupture.
And the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson will quickly spread beyond the cabinet room to the public at large.
Despite their successful compromise, Jefferson and Hamilton continue to clash. And in this divide, America's two-party political system is born. Supporters of Hamilton become known as the Federalists. They support centralized government, a national bank, alliance with Britain, and an economy based on merchants and trade. Supporters of Jefferson become the Democratic Republican Party. They support states' rights, strict interpretation of the Constitution, an agricultural economy, and an alliance with France.
It's hard for us to imagine just how acrimonious the 1790s were. You really had two opposing parties form, each of whom thought that if the other group had power, the American experiment would fail.
Jefferson and Hamilton seem to be fighting over everything. And Jefferson is telling Washington, look, Hamilton's out to get you. Hamilton's going to overthrow the Republic and institute a monarchy. And Washington's saying, nah, he's not going to do that.
Jefferson thought that Washington would side with him naturally because they're both Virginians. But Hamilton and Washington had been through the war together, and Jefferson had not been. He admired Washington, and he wanted to be the favored son of Washington. And that didn't happen.
In 1793, as the American government is taking shape, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI are brutally executed in France. And once again, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton find themselves on opposite sides of the political fence.
Jefferson feels the French Revolution is being inspired by America's example, and they topple their king, so much the better, despite the fact that the king is the person who'd bailed out the United States during the Revolutionary War. And Jefferson's idealism in this regard, his radicalism, becomes a little bloody. The statements he makes excusing the excesses, the mob in the French Revolution, are pretty close to indefensible.
He writes one of his most infamous letters in response to the French Revolution.
My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to this cause. But rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and an Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than as it is now.
It doesn't quite say you need to break a few eggs to make an omelet, but that's kind of the thinking.
He is fine with a bunch of heads rolling down in the wake of a guillotine. He's an ends just the means kind of guy when it comes to liberty. But Washington, Hamilton, Adams are much more concerned that anarchy can turn to a new type of tyranny. Washington declares a policy of strict neutrality. He says, we are not going to get dragged into continental squabbles. We are going to focus on building our own strength economically and militarily and expanding and solidifying our new nation. Jefferson is Secretary of State, but he disagrees with his government's foreign policy. So Jefferson is serving in a cabinet as Secretary of State, furious about a foreign policy he doesn't support. But not only doesn't he support it, he's actively trying to subvert it by funding and incubating a new newspaper whose sole purpose is to attack the foreign policy of the government that he is serving as Secretary of State in. It's close to treasonous. In any other context, it would be called just that. And it is driving Washington nuts to see himself being attacked in the press.
But Hamilton, he also sponsors a newspaper, which is basically the party organ of the Treasury Department. And so what we see is the media being used to mobilize political opinion in the United States. For the first time,
they're starting two political parties under the nose of Washington and against his express wishes. Washington was not a member of a political party as a matter of principle, our first and only independent president. The hope was that people in Congress would represent their conscience and their constituents, that they could do this without retreating to faction.
In 1793, George Washington begins his second term as president, and he, his Vice President John Adams, and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton continue on with the Federalist Initiative for international neutrality and a centralized federal government.
And so Jefferson concludes that he's always the odd man out. He feels that he's not getting anything accomplished and that Washington isn't listening to him anymore.
He eventually resigns in a huff.